You were born in 1924, graduated high school from New Orleans Academy, graduated in 1941, then on to Tulane University in February of 44, where you were left to serve in World War II. You returned safe and sound, thank God, at the war's end, then had a career as a lawyer and a judge and a musician. You're a father, a husband, a father, and a grandfather. Yours is such a long and full life, it is hard to discuss the breadth of it all. So I'd like to just touch on a small portion of the war years. My first question. There are a lot of videos and written records of the war years that describe the global events, but I think future generations, as well as I, would love to know the personal side of those years. And the first part of that is that you were 17 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So my first question is, what were your impressions of what was going on in the war in Europe before the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
Well, when the war in Europe started, I was 15, or almost 15, I guess. And we were all, of course, taken up by it, interested in it, but not involved. To my generation, we thought it was just a question of time before we would be involved. And my thinking then was all in that direction. I really didn't think it was going to involve me because I was, at that time, pretty young. I didn't think they were going to catch me.
Your war service is well recorded in World War II Museum in New Orleans. And you were first assigned as a gunnery officer in LST 751, which was a 368-foot ship.
328-foot long ship.
Now, before the Navy, the largest vessel you had been on was a canoe, to my understanding.
That's right.
What was it like, really, to be 19 years old as an officer in the United States Navy and a senior officer on that vessel?
Well, of course, on LST, everybody was a junior officer, including the skipper, who was a junior grade lieutenant when he took command. And all the other officers, there was one JG, and the rest of us were ensigns and as raw as you could get. I, for instance, had not even finished my officer's training. My class was commissioned before we completed our training because they needed warm bodies to man the many, many, many amphibious vessels that they were building. LSTs, LCTs, LCIs, LSDs, LSMs, and all of them took men, and the men they put on were guys like me.
Just kids?
Kids.
Who grew up real quick.
The average age on the 751, I would guess, no, I wouldn't have to guess, average age was under 19.
For the crew?
Yeah. We had one old guy who was 36, and our skipper was 26, and our first lieutenant was 30, but everybody else was in the low, not even 20, everybody else in their teens. My gunnery division consisted of one seaman first class and 5 or 6 seamen second class who had just been through boot camp, gone to striker school to learn how to be a gunner's mate, and then came on board the ship. And that was typical of the whole crew.
What I'd like to hear about is not the war years, but there was a mission post-war years where you commanded the LST 1026. Can you tell me about that one?
Sure. I was the executive officer of the 751, and I got a set of orders to take command of the LST 48, which was in Tokyo Bay, where I was. But the message never came through, so they canceled the orders, and then I got on the same day two sets of orders, one from Fifth Fleet to take command of a ship in Tokyo Bay, and the other one from headquarters in Washington to take command of the 1026, which was somewhere in China. So I called over to Fifth Fleet and I said, which one do I do? And they said, well, you do the one from Washington. So I left the 751, I caught a plane. The Navy didn't have a flight to Shanghai from Tokyo. I had to fly to Iwo Jima, to Guam, to Okinawa, to Shanghai on Navy transport. And I got to Shanghai, sure enough, the 1026 was in the harbor, and I went in and took command of it. I didn't know anything about the ship. I didn't know what she'd been doing. When we had the inspection, they had to have an inspection of the ship before you could change commands. The ship flunked the inspection. So I rode as a passenger all the way from Shanghai down to French Indochina, where we'd been sent to pick up some Chinese troops. When we got to French Indochina, there was another inspection. The ship passed, and I took command. We loaded a battalion, maybe a regiment of Chinese troops and their equipment. And in company with a bunch of other LSTs, we went up to Hulitao in Manchuria to offload these troops. Now, what we were doing was actually interfering in the Chinese Civil War, which was then going on between Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationals, and Mao Zedong and the Communists. And we're carrying these troops up to Manchuria to fight the Communists up there. I would like to add an extraneous comment here. These troops didn't know where they were or where they were going. They were poorly equipped. Some of them had their rifles in two pieces. They didn't have fuel for their trucks. The commanding officer was a 24-year-old kid who dressed up like General Patton. He had two pearl-handled revolvers, just like Patton did, and wore his helmet all the time. And that was who was in command of this bunch of disoriented troops. On the way up, there were cholera outbreaks on every ship in the convoy except ours. We were spared that, at least. When we got up to Hulitao in Manchuria, we unloaded these guys, and in order to get the trucks off the ship, they were going around with a jerry can of gas and a pint measure, and they'd pour a pint under the carburetor. And that was just enough to start the truck up and get it off the ship. And as soon as you got off the ship, the engine would die. Well, that's getting past the point of this. We got up there and discharged our cargo and went out and anchored off Hulitao and waited for our next set of orders.
How many ships were in the convoy?
You know, I don't really remember. I would guess it was 15 or 20. And the senior commanding officer was I. That tells you just how well manned all these ships were. I'd been a JG for maybe 6 months. And I was senior man, so the 1026 rode in the middle of the front row, and everybody had to keep station on us.
How many troops do you estimate were on your ship?
Oh, our capacity was to carry 250 troops in addition to our crew, so my guess would be 240 or so.
An interesting story you once told was about your change of command. And if you would, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your change of command.
Okay. The deal was that when your points were up, you could go home. If you were the commanding officer of a ship, however, you had to find a suitable replacement. And when the skipper of the 751 went home, he went home at the same time as the executive officer and the same time as the first lieutenant. And the next senior guy was my old friend from Tulane, Eddie Martin. So the captain decided Eddie was qualified to command, and Eddie decided I was qualified to be the executive officer. And that's how that happened. So when it was my turn, my points were up by the time I got to China. I was qualified to go home during this whole trip down to French Indochina and back up to Manchuria and back to Shanghai. But at the same time I came on board the ship, an officer came aboard as the first lieutenant of the 1026. And he was a black guy. He didn't look particularly black. In fact, I didn't know he was black until I looked at his service record and found out that he had attended Xavier University in New Orleans, which was then an all-black school. Now it's predominantly black, but he had gone to Xavier. He had been one of the first 13 black officers commissioned by the Navy who had resisted very strongly ever having black commissioned officers. When they couldn't resist anymore, they took 13 guys and commissioned them ensigns. After that, they didn't know what to do with them. They had one destroyer escort in the Atlantic, which had an all-black crew, and they put some of those officers on board that ship, but most of the officers were white. But some of those guys went to that DE. The rest of them were sent to schools, after school, after school, and that's what had happened to Jim. I used to know his last name. I think it was Jim Ware, something like that. But anyhow, that's what had happened to Jim. And he'd wound up as a harbor pilot in New York Harbor. And he'd gotten experience in handling every kind of ship, because that's what harbor pilots do. They handle the ships that come into the harbor. And, well, when the war was over, they began sending these guys out to ships, and they sent this one to the 1026 in China. Jim Hare. Jim was a fine officer. He knew his business. He was a great ship handler. He had no trouble handling his division. His division was all white. And of course they all knew he was black no matter how he looked. They knew, because everybody on board the ship knew everything, about everything, all the time. And so he was doing a splendid job. And after we had discharged our cargo up at Hulatow, I got to thinking, maybe this guy could relieve me, because my executive officer was an ensign. He was an Annapolis man, but he was green. He'd just gotten out there. What an Annapolis man was doing as exec on an LST, I can't imagine, but he was there just the same. And I couldn't do him. Every other officer on the ship, their points were up and they were ready to go home anyhow. But not Jim. I knew he was black. I knew that there could be a problem with that. And so I called over to Flotilla 15, which was, we were a member of that flotilla, and I talked to the flag lieutenant, and I said, look, I've got this guy that's, I think, qualified for command, and I'd like to recommend him, but he's a black guy, and I don't want to make any trouble. If you don't want him, tell me now, and I'll look somewhere else. And he said, oh, I think that'd be all right. And so I wrote the letter to the officer in Shanghai who was in charge of that sort of thing. And when we got down to Shanghai, I took Jim, and we went over to the destroyer that this captain lived on. And I went aboard, told him who I was, and they said, "Oh yes, Captain, you can go right in." And Jim started to walk with me. He said, "Not you." And so I walked on in, and this captain started reading me the riot act, and he chewed me out. Never said why. He just chewed me out. There's a thing like it's guys like you that are ruining the Navy, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was I've never before or since gotten reading out like that. And it took him about a half an hour. When he was through, I pondered saying something in my own defense. I didn't know what I was defending against. I suspected what I was defending against, but I didn't know. And when he said, "That's all," I said, "Thank you, sir," and saluted and about face and walked out. And Jim says, "What did he say? What did he say?" And I said, "I'll tell you back at the ship." So we went back to the ship, and I told Jim exactly what had happened. And he knew, just as well as I did, what the reason was. That flag lieutenant, of course, had immediately told him in Shanghai what was going on, because that guy was ready for me when I got there. And the next day, a Mustang Lieutenant J.G. showed up on the ship to relieve me. And the next day, I was on my way home. Now, I noticed when I was looking up the 1026 today on NavSource, and they have a list of the commanding officers, and they have the first one, and they have Punch Miles, who is the guy I relieved, and they have the guy who relieved me, but I'm not even on there. Now, I was only skipper for a few weeks, I guess, but I've already written them a letter saying I would like to be on that list, please, and I'll be interested to see what comes back.
Okay.
That's
what
the
I got.
story.